Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And we're the hosts of the Chasing Tomorrow podcast, where we bring you stories that delve into the science and spirit behind intriguing people doing extraordinary things.
Welcome to the Chasing Tomorrow podcast. This week, it's episode 47. This week, we're going to talk nutrition and gut health. What an important piece of any endurance athlete, or really anybody who's living and has two legs, or doesn't even have two legs, that's living on this planet. We're talking to Dina Griffin today. She's the CFO, the Chief Fueling Officer at the nutritionmechanic.com. If you haven't been to the website, it is a wealth of knowledge, and I am super stoked to talk to her today. Now, Dina is a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and sports dietitian. Outside of knowing her shit, Dina knows her stuff. Dina also walks the talk. Dina's completed the Leadville 100, Comrades Ultramarathon, Ironman Coeur d'Alene, and the Boston Marathon. I can't wait to talk about gut health with Dina. Dina, welcome to the Chasing Tomorrow podcast.
Thank you so much, Dave and Joe. I'm really honored to be here with both of you and love your show. So thanks for all you guys do.
Yeah, Dina, thanks for being on. I think we're long overdue 47 episodes without talking about probably the most significant, important part. What it means to live an extraordinary life is about nutrition. And we do a lot of things every day. Of course, we all talk about sleep, and actually next week we'll have a sleep doctor on with us. But nutrition is probably, because it's sort of like very both personal as much as it is, systemic in terms of we need to eat all the time, right? It's something that we may just sometimes take for granted. So, but before we jump into like, what should I eat for an ultra marathon? Maybe you could give us a little bit of your journey. Look, you're an ultra endurance athlete yourself, but how did the nutrition thing come to fore for you? Like, why did you pick it, and how did that become important? And then how you've gotten yourself to this place?
Thank you for asking that. The background stories are always fun. I wasn't an athlete growing up. I was a bookworm, then turned more rebellious, got into punk rock music and so forth, and then lived in the Midwest. I'm in Colorado now, but my first career was really in software and IT. But I got burned out pretty quickly working with computers and software and programming and so forth. So in that whole time, though, I moved to Colorado and I started to get into running right before that point, just because I was not living the most healthful life. From the Midwest, I grew up on mac and cheese and Spam and a lot of foods that weren't maybe in our ideal category for health and longevity. Nonetheless, started getting into running, and marathon was my first entry into running. I'll try to make this short, but there's two parts to the story. One is shortly before my move to Colorado, which was a job change, my dad had been diagnosed with a terminal cancer. In that process, though, he changed his own nutrition. So I was still in IT at the time, but I saw his own prognosis, that he would only live 3 or 4 years, extended by double that time his doctors had told him. Simply, I really believe, although I'm biased now, that a large part of that was changing his behaviors and his lifestyle and his eating habits. So that was my first light bulb, like, wow, this nutrition stuff and how we eat, it really hit home. And then the other part of this story is just my own running journey, trying to qualify for the Boston Marathon. I was working with a coach, doing my thing, and in this race I was trying to qualify, I actually had terrible GI distress. It was overfueling, but I didn't know that at the time. And there weren't a whole lot of resources. This is back quite a while ago now. I won't name exactly when, but it's quite a while ago. And it's like, oh, geez, nutrition for our daily life and health. And then for our sport, like, what is this whole sports nutrition thing? And maybe the magazines aren't telling me everything I need to know. So making the long story longer, I decided to quit my IT job, software consulting job, and go back to school for nutrition, become a registered dietitian. And I found my way to sport dietetics because I then, here in Colorado, just fell in love with the idea of being more active and fueling athletes to where they can reach their own goals with minimal issues, or just trying to help others, get to their whatever their finish lines are, and be nutritionally supportive of that endeavor. So that's where I've been in this space now for the last 14, 15 years, is more the nutrition health component, but specifically more the endurance nutrition and supporting athletes, endurance athletes of all types.
When I find that interesting, Dina, is because, I think the three of us come from an age where, we didn't have the internet and we didn't have all this really easy, free flowing information that was coming in. We were looking at magazines in order to figure out how to train for a half marathon or whatever that was. And when we end up hearing about these races, or it was just so interesting, and it was really hard to find information. But back then as well too, you end up coming up with, the information that you find, also because you're kind of curious, and so there were two instances there. What I heard, Dina, was number one, there was an illness with your father, and of course, a lot of the time we can end up, abusing our body with the fuels that we take in when everything is going well, but when something's not going well, then becomes triply important, and end up taking in the nutrients and the balances with that are necessary for flourishment. But then as well too, you've also noticed that, in endurance sport, just the important piece, because you don't need to go and run a marathon. We sign up to do this. We pay a lot of money to do this, which is kind of crazy. And we end up going and depleting ourselves for quite a long period of time to then see what happens. Because when you end up going along that fine line a long ways, you become very desperate of a lot of the nutrients that you bring in, and needless, it sounded like, Dina, you maybe failed, or you really struggled at first. Did that really spark something in your mind that thought, there is something here that I really am very curious about?
Sure, Dave. I mean, I think that's where I really got in touch with the notion of the individualization piece, that the general recommendations that actually are still quite common, but that wasn't working for me to just follow the general recommendations. And so I was missing something that was unique to me, or maybe there was some misinterpretation, or the application of what I was seeing was not right. Or perhaps there was something else. So that's what sparked this passion for really, fueling the individual from that health level, and then the performance level, and then realizing there's so many layers, as you have talked about before in your, and even just looking at the kinds of guests that you've had, right? There's so many different stories and struggles, whether that's the performance side, or the health and nutrition side, or other aspects of how the body is working, or maybe even mind-body connections. So yeah, there definitely, from my experience, that whole light bulb, turned on and got really bright.
What's interesting, Dina, is that, as you're talking, I'm thinking, okay, us, we're a system, right? But we don't think that way every day. But maybe having worked in IT, working on inputs and outputs and systems, when you switched over to the human system, you realized that those inputs would have an effect on the outputs, but on a regular daily basis, we don't think that way, right? We don't connect what we're eating with what outcomes are going to get created. But in effect, if we were writing a program, we would very much think about the data in is the data out, right? And so you would really want to clean that data before you put crummy data in and ran some algorithm and got a bad answer. You'd be like, oh, I better fix that. So do you think that that affected a little bit of the way that you view sort of the holistic interpretation of nutrition to system to output?
I love that. Actually, I hadn't thought of it quite that way. So thank you for framing it in such a way. It is fascinating to think about the computer systems and the programming that I think, as we know, there's so many nuances though with the human body, and it's pretty complex. And unfortunately, we don't always get the, the red X showing up glaring in our face, that we can head down a path and think that we're okay, eating okay, feeling the body okay, and then there is an injury or some other illness or some other occurrence that then it might be a little too late to kind of reprogram. We've got to heal and then start over. So some different iterations, but certainly that systems and number of systems in the body, thinking of the intricacy that does align a bit with how computers and tech world works.
Yeah. So maybe we could start with maybe give some of the basics, if you wouldn't mind, to the listeners. Everything a little bit from carbohydrates, fat, protein to calories to energy sources to like what happens to the body when they adjust. What would you say is an entry level discussion? If you could just start us there.
Ooh, boy, that's a big one. Geez. I mean,
no pressure, right?
Yeah, like, okay, let me get my Nutrition 101 resource out. Well, I can start, and then maybe you guide me where you'd like to go. In our foods, no matter what style of eating pattern, if we just say like a mixed diet, or I don't even care for the word diet, so maybe a mixed nutrition pattern, we've got proteins, carbohydrates, and fats as our main three macronutrients. And so each of those have different roles in the body. Protein is, I think, kind of like this foundational macronutrient for us active, athletic, ultra athletes. It's something where it's such a crucial role in maintenance of muscle tissue, repair of muscle, roles in hormone regulation and in bone health and immunity, that it's got to be there, obviously. But there's no exact when we talk about all three of these macronutrients. And if you were to pin me down, like, well, how much exactly should we be eating? That's where this individual piece has to come in. But proteins in general will be anything from your seafood fish to your poultry or wild game, beef, eggs, some dairy foods, and then our plant proteins, which we have so many, nuts and seeds, legumes, lentils, tofu, and so forth. So a lot of options for proteins. And then carbohydrates, we've got, kind of thinking of fruits, veg, your grains, whole grains, and then, our extras can fall into the carbohydrates, meaning sugars, right? So maybe that's added sugar, for example. And then fats. So I should just add to the carbohydrate piece. That's typically the source of energy that athletes will have in a higher intake of. But again, the amount, it kind of depends on the kind of athlete, what kind of training we're doing, what we're working on health-wise. And then third macro are fats. And I think, at least from my era, which back in the 70s, 80s, fat was a no-no, and we were trying to be fat-free and fat-phobic, and not eat the fat. And so a lot has changed in that realm. But so fats would be, again, an important role in hormone balance, important for supporting various tissues in the body. we don't need to be fat-free. So thinking of kinds of foods with fats would be things like avocado, your nuts and seeds, coconut. For people who do butter, that kind of thing, we have olives and olive oil. So there's just this whole array of different foods that we can, nudge into these categories. But when it comes to looking at our needs as athletes or active people, again, there's not a certain right, wrong or right. It's really figuring out that individual need, and just trying to optimize and periodize those nutrients so that we perform to our best, recover to our best, and live our most healthful life that we're able to.
Yes. So Dina, when it comes to the macronutrients, and and of course we can get all into the micronutrients later on, but let's stick with the big three: the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats. It's a conversation you have with friends who are all, a lot of my friends are distance runners, and everybody feels that they're nailing it, that they have the right answer, and their answer is very different than the next guy. And so, like for me, anecdotally, I just, over the years, I take in more of this and less of this, and how does this feel, and how's my performance here? And I think that most people kind of do that, where they play and they pay attention to how they're feeling and how they're performing, and is there brain fog, is there good ample recovery time, how much carbohydrates are you taking per day, what kind of carbohydrates are you taking? Is there any one, maybe is there blood work that you can be doing with your doctor, your dietitian? Is there any other way outside of test and see how it goes, and making up a system for yourself? Is there any other methods that one can kind of find when it comes to, oh, hey, maybe I need to be taking in more plant-based proteins, or more heavy grains for carbohydrates? Any hints that way?
And you're talking about to just ensuring that you're meeting your needs, and
You bet.
Yeah.
You bet.
So, I mean, what you mentioned in terms of like, how are you feeling? That is something really important to keep tabs on. Because I think a lot of us think that we feel okay. And then if we use some other metrics, getting into nerdy numbers and things, or HRV, things like this, like, oh no, actually I'm forcing it a little bit. My body needs a little bit more TLC. So that's not something I like to neglect, is actually asking, so how are you feeling today? And after this big, 100-mile day, what's going on? Or how are you recovering 2 days later or a week later? But blood work is huge. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Dave, because that is something I'm a big fan of, is routine or regular blood work monitoring, and making sure we have some athlete-specific markers, particularly for our plant-based athletes or plant-focused athletes, with high mileage, or even just our ultra athletes putting in a ton of training load, ton of training demands on the body, is looking at certain markers to see, trying to catch anything before it happens, deficit wise. So that could be iron or B12 or inflammation markers. But that's really an inexpensive way to keep tabs on our own health, whether or not someone like me is involved. But it's data that, it's a snapshot, sort of, depending on the marker. Some can be reflective of the last couple months. But that's an inexpensive way to get some objective indicator of what's going on. Of course, we have some other physiology testing we can do, putting you on a metabolic card. I don't know if either of you have done that recently. It'd be fascinating. If you come to Colorado, look me up. Looking at how we use our fuel sources during running.
Oh yeah, I did that.
Did you? Okay. Yeah, that's some testing that I do, and it's very insightful and can be helpful for even planning events, race nutrition wise or training wise. There's some other tests that I like to do, but I would say blood work would be in the top. We can keep food logs and put stuff into apps and trackers. It's just that those tend to not be very athlete specific yet.
Yeah.
And so I find some issues, it's still based on some formulas that aren't really, they're just lacking a bit, in my opinion, in terms of trying to optimize energy intake for endurance athletes.
Yeah, no, I think that building on that a little bit, Dina. Yeah, I was a part of a test on a sports drink, and they did a 10-week program, and every week we were put in a heat chamber, actually riding on a bike at 70% of our max heart rate, and they had multiple temperature sensors, took blood and urine tests, but there was a lead up battery of tests that were done, and we took a look at your fat burning and carbohydrate burning at different heart rates, and sort of really measured that out. And it was fascinating. The one thing I would tell everyone listening is almost every sensor that you can use, a treadmill, your watch, they overestimate the calories you're burning. I am completely convinced of that, because if it was actually accurate, I would weigh about a pound, because I would be losing weight all the time. And I'm pretty stable for the past 7 years within probably 2 or 3 pounds. But the amount of hours I work out relative to what it says you're getting burned is not at all near. Like, we burn a lot less. To get to the 700 or 800 calories an hour that a treadmill might show you, you'd have to be in high zone 4 for a long time, like in the heart rate. And you'll see that crossover between the carbohydrates and the fat, that point in time when it's almost 80% carbohydrates. So, but that data is helpful, because it sort of resets a little bit of, how you think about what's your body doing. And that's why that, sort of what we call that fat burning zone, that zone 2, I've taken to, and I think Dave and a lot of really good runners know that you can go for long periods of time at lower effort and build real strong fitness, because that fat burning system, when it gets triggered, is a better energy system, right? And so these are some of the subtleties that you don't really fully understand. So that data for us, I guess, one of the things I guess we could say to our listeners is, if you are a bit of a geek about this, there is data you can get that will help you think better about what's going on, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your own body curiosity or physiology, and what your goals are or what your struggles have been from a training perspective, or trying to achieve top level fitness, or if you have had goals, specific racing goals, or other, pursuits that you have not been able to achieve, and you have the means to explore all those fun tests. I guess not all of them are fun per se, but just learning what you can about your body, because then we can use that information to adapt training, programming, or nutrition, or other elements, recovery, or other aspects could be revealed, to really help finesse what you're doing.
Yeah, well, so Dina, let's get into a really kind of a broad question, but maybe a difficult question too. Is, in your opinion, looking at the endurance community, let's call it marathon plus, either in triathlon or endurance swimming or running, what do you think the number one problem that you see amongst athletes is, that's a reoccurring issue time and time again that people are getting wrong?
The number one, I would say, and of course, my clientele, it's kind of biased, right? Because people come to me with some sort of issue. But I will say, of all the issues I'm looking at, GI distress seems to be the top issue still, and it's been that way for a number of years. So I would say that's the number one.
Tell us more about what you mean by GI distress.
Yeah, gastrointestinal distress. I'm sure we've all been there one way or another. So, I mean, what it is, the scope of symptoms and signs we could look at just to give a feel for how we know when we have it. Could be upper GI, where we're maybe having acid reflux. I mean, if we look at the research, they'll even put burping and, some of things that we may not see as that significant, like I can handle a few burps. But the more severe GI symptoms or GI distress would be abdominal cramping or maybe bloating that's not feeling good, like a lot of tension in the lower abdominals. We could have gas, right? Or diarrhea. Of course, the other upper GI issue is vomiting. So those last few are pretty significant and can certainly affect what's going to happen next or what we need to decide to do from a hydration and nutrition perspective. And then the reasons that GI stress happen, I mean, it's multifactorial, right? Especially when you're looking at the distances that you guys do or the kinds of events you do, depending on intensity, weather conditions, altitude, the choices of our fueling and hydration, what's in those foods or products. There's a lot of layers there. So we kind of have to piece that apart to figure out what's causing what.
Absolutely. And so, go ahead, Joe.
You can finish a follow-up.
Yeah, well, so one question I have is, Dina, do you think that you can train for gastric emptying? Can you train your gut in training in order to better perform on race day?
I think absolutely. I mean, we have some science to show that, right? But you're hinting at something important, which is maybe a mistake a number of athletes make, is not doing that proper gut training with the same kinds of fuels we plan to use on our event or race day and looking at hydration. Of course, if we could mimic everything that we're going to face on our main day, weather-wise, altitude and all that would be ideal. But we definitely can train the gut to an extent.
Yeah, and so Dina, I mean, sorry, Joe. I know you're going to ask a question, but I got to ask this because this was, I think it's a funny story, and I would love to hear what your comments are on this. I was running with a friend years ago, and have you ever seen the movie Dodgeball? It's a stupid comedy, yeah. And in order to train to dodge the ball, the guy would throw wrenches at people, and he says, if you could dodge a wrench, you could dodge a ball. It's funny. But and so that what he was doing was in his training is he was eating bean burritos. He was eating a tremendous amount of food that would normally be really difficult to digest, and you would never really do on race day. And he said, if you could dodge a wrench, you could dodge a ball. And he wanted to train his body by doing things that would be really difficult to digest during a run. Would you think that's a reasonable training method?
I mean, maybe there are some elements there. I would be more specific though, and actually challenge the body with the things that you think might be in the, in the day's offerings, or
right.
you think you may want or crave or need. So yeah, there's like the amount piece, like 4 bean burritos an hour, maybe not. But then there's what's in that particular food. Like, do we have the hot sauce or not?
Right.
Yeah, but I would say I guess depending on our preference, I mean, carbohydrates typically make up the bulk of our calories during our training and racing. However, we know the longer we're going, of course, intensity dependent, we can tolerate, some fats and proteins and like real food. So the bean burrito can work for some people, certainly, or the pizza or whatever, bacon and things like this. It's just we need to look at also what the benefit is perhaps of that kind of food and make sure we're putting it in the context as much as we can and considering intensity. And if it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit out, we may not want bean burritos.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
I wouldn't anyways.
No, me too.
But yeah, so I have so many questions. This is the hard thing to do here. One though is a little bit of this idea of under eating versus overeating. And, sort of the idea that maybe if I have a little bit less, that would be treating me better in these kinds of environments versus making sure I had plenty, eating the day before versus eating during the race, and sort of like the whole sort of balance of volume. Any sort of advice for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, and you're saying, Joe, more event, race
Yeah,
oriented
like
time
not during a
frame?
normal day, but like when you're going to go do a big run on a Saturday, or you're going to run in a race, and when you're going to put more stress on your system than you would normally do.
For sure.
Would you suggest under eating? Not under eating meaning not eating, but just less, like feeling almost a little
Yeah.
bit like you need more, or not?
I know, be right, because there's the under eating to be safe, right? Because we're
Yeah.
scared that the extra pickle or the extra broccoli piece might be too much. There's that worry, and then there's like the over, because again, we've come from classic carbohydrate loading, which was like eat till you're stuffed. And
Spaghetti dinner. Yeah.
exactly. So there's almost those extremes that still exist a bit. Of course, I'm not one to just say, well, do the moderation thing, because some of us don't know what that is, and we can still put in our own beliefs around, well, what is that? So we have to look at what it is we're going to be enduring that next day. I'm more a fan of, again, like we've practiced this stuff way before now. So that's something to keep in mind for the last minute folks. Like, oh gosh, can we think ahead and practice this day before, well in advance of our race or our event, so we know what works. But amount wise, volume wise, it's like you've got to look at what's in these meals. I certainly like to take up the carbohydrate elements. I'm going to use a word you're going to roll your eyes, but like, let's take it up a bit. It's like, that's not specific. It might mean eating a little bit more sweet potato or what your rice or something, but it's not stuffing. Especially we know now for women, carb loading does not work. I'll just say it like that. It's not as effective as it is in men. So we have some considerations for, again, the individual. But a lot of the recommendations are still like, don't eat much fat, don't eat fiber, be careful of this and that and the other thing the day before. It's just, if we haven't practiced that, I often see the next day, like even if you think of bowels, if we just took out a whole bunch of fiber and you're used to having fiber, and then you can't do your morning bathroom visit, that might then start you off already uncomfortable. So again, I know I'm not giving you a simple answer, but it's like stuff to think about.
Yeah, and one thing I've always thought, Dina, with pre-race and typically whatever you'd eat, you just bump it up 10%, 15%, and have a normal diet. Would you agree? Is that a pretty broad, reasonable statement?
I love that. Yeah, I've said for some athletes, maybe it's a 25%, but it's at 10 to 25, like an extra handful on your plate, depending on what it is. Yeah.
You bet.
One of the other subtleties, because we live a bunch of lives, right? We work, we exercise, most of us are not professionals doing this as our lives. And this balance between what we'll call food and fuel. So there's the food part of our life, it could be tradition, it could be what we reward ourselves with, it could be what makes us feel good. I like pizza, so I'm going to eat pizza. My grandmother used to make it, so I like it. And then there's the fuel piece, which is back to both macronutrients, micronutrients, and thinking about how we run our system better. And do you have advice for people balancing those two? Because, if you don't want to just have this pure justification of the reason I'm eating it is tradition. And because if you're going to try and fuel, you want to then optimize for that circumstance. Any thoughts on that?
I like for everyone to enjoy food.
Good.
So it's good for us to understand and connect to that and be okay. Like that's a gift and an honor, right? To enjoy food, and not all of us have the means to have all the foods we want, right? So we really have to appreciate and consider that piece. So I'm definitely a fan of like connecting with like the intention and the purpose and the enjoyment factor. As athletes, I think though we can get specific and more purposeful of what this food is doing for you and your performance, if it's important to you. I guess, there are all levels of athletes, and some of us just want to go have pure fun. It doesn't matter what the result is. But I think as athletes, we can connect to a little bit more of that purpose around nutrition without making it stressful or restrictive or diety. It's like, this is my oomph that I'm, and really work with that and cherish what that can do for us. It's kind of a woo-woo answer, but
I like that. That's good.
But I like that. Yeah, and there's got to be that purpose. Otherwise, I enjoy chocolate cake and I would eat it every breakfast. But it doesn't serve me. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. But Dina, you ended up touching on just a few minutes ago about carb loading and women. And so what you're telling me is that women aren't just little men. What you're telling me is that there's a specific diet and that there's a definite approach when it comes to female athletes versus male athletes. And of course, this has made the news a lot in the last decade. And, tell us a little bit more about that approach, because of course it's true. But I want to hear some of your thoughts on women in sport and how the nutrition and the diet advice is now very different.
Thank you, Dave. Gold star for bringing that up. Yeah, I mean, I think because so much of our sports nutrition recommendations have come from, if we look at the body of research and the subjects in those research studies, young male, college age males make up a good portion of those research studies where we've got those recommendations. But in the last 10 years, more so in the last 5, this appreciation and realization that women's physiology is unique, and our sex hormones, of course, we've known this all along, our hormones are different and fluctuate quite a bit. But what does that mean as athletes and for our performance in training, nutrition, recovery, and so forth? So we're learning things like, how our bodies, for menstruating women, how the different phases of the menstrual cycle can affect nutrient turnover, or how we burn fats and carbohydrates. So it's really working with understanding where we are in our menstrual cycles for those who have natural menstrual cycles, understanding where we are and how those hormones can affect training ability, nutrient needs, energy needs. And then even as we age into perimenopause, postmenopause, considering that there's some other newer findings, there's still a lot we don't know, but at least we're kind of on the cusp of seeing that there is more we need to know. And I think it's so exciting that I could probably beg you guys to come back or have me back so we could talk just about that.
Absolutely.
But,
I think it's good. I think that there are topics like that, which another one connected, and we can come back to it, but is this idea of body size, right? So there's 2 big issues, I think, in the world around food. There's the female and the male, how different we are, and then there's a body size, and that we have some judgment about, the size of how big we should be and how that would affect our nutrition needs, and that there are different body types who have different nutrition needs, and there's no judgment that should be. And there is certainly enough people who have eating disorders uh, and you don't even know it sometimes because of just the way that you go about it. And so balancing that out, I think the more we talk about it, the better, right? Because then we don't hide from it and we can address it. Yeah, any thoughts on, the second subject that we need to make sure we cover here?
Yeah, it's so important. I think just this more inclusive aspect of sport and who you are as an athlete or who is an athlete, that it's not the certain body size that you have to fit into to be an ultra runner or an ultra athlete or any kind of athlete. So this is also something that's long overdue, right? And
Mhm.
things like diet culture don't help that aspect, that you need to look a certain way in order to achieve certain things. So I think, you know, even your podcast, right, and just bringing that attention that we have all kinds of feats that we can achieve, and same with who achieves those pursuits. It's not a skin color or a body size or a country you have to be from, that it's all humans that can do these amazing things.
Mhm.
Right.
So Dina, let's jump a little bit more from, we talked about macronutrients. Let's talk about micronutrients for a little bit. And, one topic that's come up a lot in the endurance community is really how many electrolytes do we really need to be consuming during activity? Of course, you could be running in the desert, or you could be running in cool up here in Canada, and it's going to be very, very different. But there was the book, I think it was called Waterlogged by Noakes, that came out years ago, and that really transitioned a lot of people into thinking, okay, you know what, you really don't need to be taking in any sodium. Do you have any thoughts and theories, any wisdom that you can pass along to our guests? Because I know it's a really confusing topic for most.
It is. Yeah, I made my way through that book a number of years ago too, so I'm familiar with it. I mean, there are a few issues that we do have to consider. So some of this might be obvious, but um, like you mentioned, Dave, if we're in hot, humid weather versus cooler weather, that can affect our sweat production. So we have fluid losses, right? Depending on intensity and weather conditions and some other factors.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have what's in our sweat. So you're referring to the electrolyte composition, namely sodium, which is the electrolyte we lose the most of in our sweat. So there's that theory that, we can look at some data like, you know what, these people survived is the key word, survived these conditions with just water and they made it fine, they didn't die. But we can look at other conditions where if we change that word from survival to actually optimally performing, I will argue that taking in appropriate amounts of electrolytes, specifically sodium, can actually help us with thermoregulation, replenishment of some of that sodium and fluid that we are losing, especially for those of us who are heavy sweaters and salty sweaters. So I'm not on either end, like you don't need them or else you must take them all the time. I think it is this individual piece again that we come back to. So, like Dave, how sweaty are you in
Mm-hmm.
January doing your 60K day versus in July? Is there a difference? And then what are your losses? And then what kind of training block are you in? And what's your daily nutrition like? Because those factors all have to become part of the story when we're
Right.
trying to fine tune.
Absolutely. And I think one of the comments I get often is it's really difficult to find product that, okay, if I need to increase my sodium content, but I don't need my potassium, or oh, okay, I need a lot of magnesium, or I need, it's really hard to find a product that has kind of the right amounts of all those things all the time. Do you find that there's any blood work, any tests that one can do in order to find a better solution for them?
I mean, blood work, maybe not quite as much, but we can do some measurement of your sweat sodium and that's, there's different ways to do that. And there's some debate around the efficacy and things, but if we have the right equipment, we can look at the sodium piece and dial that part in and know how much you lose per liter of sweat. So that is helpful, but then we have to understand how sweaty you are in varying conditions. But yeah, I know I do like if we are finding or making our own products or purchasing a product, I do like the more complete electrolyte formula that does have some magnesium and calcium. And of course, the sodium piece is pretty important, and the potassium versus just pounding salt or just drinking, solution with table salt in it. Like we can benefit, especially the longer duration we need. I guess the other thing to add though is what we're eating, because we can eat some salty foods or some other things to get our other electrolytes.
Few potato chips here and there, huh? So let's talk about racing a little bit. And, there have been more companies who have designed and created lots of formats for us. We got goos, we got shot blocks, we got bars, we have liquid calories, we have, we wouldn't even be able to list all of the different variations, right? And so there is, of course, as you stated, I think it's always good to think about, have you ever tried them before try it in a race? I mean, unless you're in desperate conditions, you have nothing else to eat, you would try anything. But any advice, other than the try it ahead of time, like how to balance, like, well, maybe I should have that real piece of pie that Dave likes versus my 7th gel, or I'm only on a liquid calorie thing as I go along. Because it is one of the few sports where we have all of this stuff that's been designed not to truly look like food, but serve our nutritional needs. Any input for our audience?
Yes. I mean, again, this is something like you're saying, Joe, there are so many options, whether it's engineered or we just look at like all the, whole food options we have. But I think it's also important for newer athletes to explore and know that you're not confined to just do energy gels or what maybe the sports nutrition companies are making you believe, that this one product is the only thing that will solve all your, needs. So I think it's great for athletes to explore if they're newer to endurance sport or ultra. Like we have so many options that are from the grocery store versus the sports nutrition company. So that can be, I mean, again, so many. So there's, dried fruits. We can make our own bars, our own energy bites, dates, things like this. I mean, pickles, right? I mean, there's a lot of options. So thinking of your own gut tolerance for the more experienced athletes. So if you've tried certain kinds of foods or sports nutrition and it hasn't worked for you in terms of GI distress or other negatives, then we can pursue other options to try and be more gentle or modify that composition. It also could be an amount issue. So yeah, I mean, I'm not anti-sports nutrition, but I'm certainly not the sport dietitian who's pushing, 4 energy gels an hour, because I think we have a lot of other options. Some athletes do well with the liquid nutrition all-in-one formulas. I don't see that too commonly, and so I think if we can find mixed sources, meaning if we can tolerate some solid food in little nibbles along the way and it tastes good, we're not going to get tired and tired of it in,
Mhm.
2 seconds later, then that's another option. There are a lot of great homemade options for, rice concoctions or our own energy bars, things like this. But yeah, so I don't know that I answered that question super well, but a
Good. I
lot
think,
of opportunity.
what I found actually, one of the things we sometimes ignore a little bit is we're getting feedback often as we're eating. And we sort of ignore it. Like, we won't name a sports drink, but there's one that we all probably have had before. And you're on your fifth one and it just starts to taste terrible. You're like, okay, I just cannot drink this anymore. I think that's the body sort of saying to you, okay, you need something else. We've figured out that this isn't working. So stop, because otherwise it would taste great. And I think that there's like that time where you just get into the aid station, you just want oranges. Like, I didn't want orange at the last one. Why? The brain is pretty smart. It's looking and assessing, and maybe subconsciously, whatever the system that's working. So sometimes there are signals and we ignore them, and they're not just random and they're not coincidental at all.
Agree. That intuitive sense that,
Mhm.
yeah, if you're craving something salty or sweet or savory or whatever, that there's something to that. And so I'm always a big fan, of the plan B or the plan C, which is like, well, let's go with what your gut says, right? Or
Mhm.
what your mind is saying to the gut, or the other way around. But yeah, that listening piece, and that's something really important that we can practice in our long training days.
Right.
We might have a plan, but if it's not working, don't force it. What's the plan B? And then having those options.
No, I couldn't agree more. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about fat adapted diets and keto diets. I mean, it's 2021. They started becoming, I think, a little bit more popular 5 years ago, 3 years ago. They really got popular, and then we've seen some incredible performances by these fat adapted athletes. Can you maybe explain to our guests what fat adapted means, and why would some of these athletes you want to go down the keto route?
Yeah, Dave. I mean, fat adaptation, when we think of that, it's important to know that the body primarily has two fuel sources to burn during exercise. I'll just say exercise. So we have fats and carbohydrates. Uh, and I'll just leave it simple like that instead of going into all the aspects or details, unless you want to do that. But fat adaptation means that we teach the body through our training and our nutrition strategies to burn more of our calories from stored fat versus depleting or tapping into our carbohydrate stores. And the reason to teach the body to become more fat adapted is because we have thousands and thousands more stored calories from fat than we do from glycogen or our carbohydrate availability. So there's like, maybe a couple thousand calories worth of glycogen that we can store and use, but that, depending how fast we're going, how hard we're going, or our metabolic health, we can easily, quickly deplete glycogen stores. So the benefit of fat adaptation is teaching the body um, to pull from our fat stores. Even if we're super lean, we can be more fat adapted. And when we translate that to performance, the thinking or theory or application is, well, if I'm burning a lot of my stored fat and I'm preserving my glycogen, I'm not depleting it, I'm not going to bonk as quickly. I also likely don't have to eat 400 calories of sugar an hour because I'm not burning it as much. And so I guess part of the beauty of fat adaptation is it's when we put people on the metabolic cart and look at how they burn their fuels, uh, can run at a pretty high intensity and still be mobilizing fat for your energy. There's some downsides to this, but that's sort of the draw to things like ketogenic diets or low carb diets, because that fueling pattern, how we eat every day, teaches the body then to not be dependent on so much carbohydrate. Again, there's some, negatives or things we have to really pay attention to if we're in that strategy.
Yeah, and I think that, it's always worth sort of experimenting, like you said, beforehand and see if it works. I tend to think, I love the stories of, a runner who, never ate, I don't know who it was, one of the professional women ultra runners. She never ate Doritos, but ate them throughout a whole 100-mile race and never ate them again. But that was what worked for her, and so sometimes it is both the prep and sometimes it's the moment and seeing how, being just more attuned, I think, to what's happening and how the system's working. And it does take practice. Eating's as much a practice as the running or the swimming or the biking or those others, right? And we usually just eat, sort of breakfast, lunch, dinner, but then we change it into, and for a race or some other activity.
Yeah, and I should add, like you can still become more fat adapted without having to resort to a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet. I mean, I'm sure you've probably mentioned this before, but just like our training itself makes us pretty good fat burners.
Right.
We can override that a bit with our nutrition choices, but I didn't want to come across saying everybody should be keto in order to be the best fat burner, because there are some concerns there. But to your question, Dave, I mean, that is still an appeal for a lot of ultra athletes. It just needs to be, if we're going to do that, I'd say like give me a call or like work with somebody, because I've seen a lot of athletes fall apart, just missing details of, to more construct your pattern and approach, so we're not missing micronutrients and overall calories and other things.
Right, and like most people, I find too, but maybe even more so in the endurance community, everybody's all or nothing, and they go for the way too far of a run, way too many mountains, way too whatever, and so yeah, they go from a balanced diet to ketosis, and within a month, and their training fails and they end up getting a stress fracture or something. So maybe let's talk about that a bit, but when it comes to injury and stress fractures, how much do you think that has to do with our diet or lack of maybe parts of our nutritional balance?
Yeah, I think nutrition plays a role. I mean, I'm in the sense that oftentimes when we see someone with multiple stress fracture history or bone injuries, a lot of times it comes down to inadequate calories, to be honest. We're just not putting in enough for the body to take care of all the systems of the body, right? So this bone integrity, there's constant bone remodeling going on and bone turnover. So that has been shown to be connected. And so that's regardless of the kind of diet we want to follow. It's just like a lack of calories coming in. Of course, there could be some things with vitamin D and calcium and magnesium, protein, and so forth. But, I'll start with just calories. So if it's, we just need to eat a couple more snacks or, bulk up, whatever it is. And then we can finesse the details.
I think we've covered a lot of this, Dina, but I wouldn't mind if you could just, before we end up wrapping up, a little bit of the basics as to someone who's new, who's sort of getting into this. What would be like your 3 pieces of advice you would give them as they sort of venture into, going a little farther, a little harder, sort of evolving, sort of the way they live and the way they train before they would come see you, and because they'd come see you a little bit later kind of thing. But in the beginning, what are those like, what's the general advice you'd give someone?
So I'd say one thing is to I'm sorry if this sounds dorky, but it's like really paying attention to how you feel, right? I know we can say that. It's like, well, what does that mean? But really connecting, if you, and this could be even on a rest day, just like what you're eating, how do you feel energy wise, fatigue wise, stomach wise, brain power? Because if you're feeling off or on or ups and downs, I mean, that can be a sign we need some shifting, right? Or some optimization. So it's like learn your body.
Yep.
Secondly would be, it doesn't hurt to make notes. So a lot of us keep our training logs. We want to know how far we ran, how fast or whatever. But I would say take notes of how you're eating around your training. Because if you have a kind of a crappy run or a crappy bike or whatever, I mean, that could relate to what you've done prior, hydration wise, nutrition wise, or some other things. So I think just making some simple notes is helpful. So there's two things. If I had to say a third thing, Joe, I would just say don't feel like you have to follow one diet to be perfect, that there is so much freedom and flexibility and room to be a strong athlete. So being careful to fall into a diet trap.
Dina, you're wonderful. You're really a treat. This has been fantastic. All these nuggets of wisdom that you've given both Joe and I and all of our guests. We can't thank you enough. But when you're gifting the world and helping support us, one question we want to ask you is, what's your chasing tomorrow? What's next for you? I know we're in the middle of this pandemic. We're all doing this together. We're getting through this. This has been a long year. What's next for Dina Griffin?
Oh, yeah. Thank you guys. It's been an honor to be with you. When I think of chasing tomorrow, I have to say what I come to is like, how am I living my best today so that I can show up tomorrow to keep building on that. So for me, it's engagement, it's learning, and it's also accepting the challenges and maybe the hard times and really learning from those opportunities. So, I mean, I put that into my own training and racing as well. But just generally, when I think of that, it's like, I'm giving the most to my today that I can, because this is all I have is right now. And then hopefully tomorrow I get to repeat this and then some.
That's great. Well,
that's beautiful.
We wish you the best with that. I do think we have a topic that needs repeat visits. So I think we're going to have you back on this in a period of time when we can build on the foundation and pull some questions from our listeners that we could answer for them, because sort of as our fuel system goes, our whole system is going to go, and we want that all to be as best as possible for us as well as everyone listening, and develop a good relationship with food, and life can really work in our favor.
Well, thank you both. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, I'm very grateful.
All right. Thanks, Dina. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Dina.
Thank you.